Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Mark Twain House and Museum. I cannot believe how many people are registered for this event. So thank you all for being here. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And it's great to see so many old friends and new friends here this evening. And I love that you're chatting away already. I'm not going to talk for too long, but I just want to introduce you to a few features of Crowdcast and say a few things before we welcome our guests for the evening, who I'm sure you're eager to hear talk. I'm going to start with, before the housekeeping, just a remark about today and how important it is. It was a year ago yesterday that the staff at the Mark Twain House and Museum met for our staff meeting, not in our regular meeting room, but in our big auditorium where we could be spaced out from one another. And that was the last day that we congregated on site as a staff. And we thought it would be a few weeks. And we talked about, we've got our 3D virtual reality tour. Let's share that with people so they can stay connected. Had we known it was going to be a year and counting, I don't know what we would have done. But I want you to know that the staff has worked very hard in this past year to remain engaged, remain connected with our communities through our public programming and during the a little bit of times that we've been able to be open for our guided house tour. And I just want to say on behalf of the staff and the trustees of the museum, how much we appreciate your support. It's been really important to us and kept us going, and we've really felt like we've created some great relationships over the past year, so thank you. I would like to add to that, though, that we have been without our major source of revenue for the past year. Our guided house tour is our main source. We don't, we're not a state or a federal museum. We're a private nonprofit organization, and so that revenue really means a lot to us. In the absence of that, you see that green button beneath my face right now that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. Donations from people like yourselves have been keeping us afloat for the past year. And anything, a $5 donation, a $50 donation, whatever anybody can afford, I just want you to know that it is deeply appreciated by the board and the staff and is put to very good use and is used to honestly support programs such as this, which are free for people like you to take advantage of, but are not free for us to mount. So anything you can do to help us with that would be terrific. I would add to that too that tonight Ty is going to be talking about his wonderful new book, Robert E. Lee and Me. We are well aware that you can purchase this just about anywhere you like. But I want you to know that when you purchase your signed copy through this program tonight, your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So there's a little added value to you in that, and it's certainly added value to us. So please consider making that purchase. It's a signed copy, and I think that after tonight's talk, you're going to really want to have that in your hands. So thank you for considering that. So for those of you who are new to Crowdcast, yes, the chat, you're all already chatting, and keep that up, please. Let us know who you are and where you're from, and know that the chat remains live in perpetuity. So this program is being recorded. You can go back onto our website, which is marktwainhouse.org, and watch it anytime you like. And if you've made a friend here or started a conversation, you can continue it there. However, at the end of our program, we are going to have a Q&A session. And if you have a question for Ty or Jeff, who I'll talk about in a moment, please put it in that little Ask a Question section at the bottom of your screen. Somebody's already put a question there, so we're already getting going there. And that makes it a lot easier for us to facilitate the Q&A at the end of the program. Having said all of that, I think that's all the housekeeping I want to do, except to let you know that we have dozens of programs coming down the pike. We are keeping very busy. Our calendar is full. I'm not going to take time right now to enumerate all of those, but I do invite you, again, to go to marktwainhouse.org and see everything that we have coming up. I think you'll be pleased. So tonight's guests, I want to let you know that we are welcoming Jeffrey Nichols. He is the executive director of Georgetown Heritage, and Many of you know he's the former executive director at the Mark Twain House and Museum. So this is a little bit of Old Home Week, welcoming Jeff back. And Ty Seidule, we just learned how to say his name, and he's going to correct me, although he was very gracious about it, is a retired Brigadier General and Professor Emeritus of History at West Point, and of course, author of this wonderful book, Robert E. Lee and Me. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Ty and Jeff. And it takes a moment for them to get up on screen, so. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'll come back up for the Q&A, okay?
Great.
Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And Ty, before we start, I just want to, again, thank you for joining us at the Mark Twain House and Museum tonight. It's wonderful for you to do that. And I'm thrilled to be back. I left 9 years ago, and this is my first event with this organization in a long time. And it's really happy to be back amongst all my Twainiac friends. So thank you for having me. And Ty, I always like it when I was at the Twain House to start these conversations or have a speaker who came in to talk a little bit about Mark Twain and how he influenced your life, if he did. I know from reading your book, he has. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your history with Twain as a child, and also, I believe he also spent some time at West Point.
He did. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for doing this. And for Jennifer, thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be at the Mark Twain House Museum virtually. And I want to thank everybody that's here. Look how many people are here. Thank you so much for coming to join Jeff and me today. Well, two things about Twain. One is that when I was in high school, I got a copy of Twain's complete works. They come in these huge paperback books, volume 1 and 2, and I read every single one of them. I will admit that I read some of them in class in high school rather than pay attention to whatever boring subject there was. I read Twain. He was a much better company. And then the second way is at West Point. So Twain visited West Point 10 times between 1876 and 1890. He loved being with the cadets, loved talking about the cadets. And I think he actually was there at at the recently renovated cadet mess hall. He ended up giving a formal talk, and he read his English as she is taught, which is one of the things he wrote. And then he was also famous for going one day. We always have parades at West Point. It's one of the things we do. If you ever get to West Point, got to see a parade. So he was the guest for this parade, came out in the line with the general and the colonel and the colonel and the general, still smoking his stogie, which of course was just, could not do that. But Twain, of course, could get away with anything, and smoking a stogie is something he was going to do anyway, no matter what. So I do have fond memories of Twain, both as a kid and then as a historian.
Well, that's great. And it does sound like something exactly like Mark Twain would have done, even at a place like West Point. So glad to say he was still in character then. Yeah. Your book, Robert E. Lee and Me, I read through it and enjoyed it very much. And for those of you who don't know, that after I left the Mark Twain House, I went south. I went to Virginia to a historic site called Thomas Jefferson's Papa Forest, Jefferson's Retreat House, and Plantation, or as you refer to it in your book, Enslaved Labor Farm. That's exactly what it was. And so, although we're obviously different arcs of our career in life, I have a sense of Virginia now that I didn't have when I was a Connecticut Yankee. And in your book, you talk about quite a bit about growing up in the South, and you often refer to this idea of the Virginia gentleman or the Southern gentleman and what that meant to you as a child. And also, a quote that you write in the book is that you couldn't remember life without Robert E. Lee. Could you talk a little bit about what you meant by, as a child, what you thought a Virginia gentleman was, and how Lee fit into that narrative?
Well, Lee, I can't remember. Lee was omnipresent. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, at Episcopal High School, which is a boys' boarding school, very elite boys' boarding school, where my dad was a teacher and a coach. And we had descendants of Lee there, and he was the epitome of a Virginia gentleman. And I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman because it came with status, its power, and it's a certain nobility, noblesse oblige, that came with being this sort of Virginia gentleman. And we all knew growing up in Virginia that there were other gentlemen. They were just a slightly lower caste than a Virginia gentleman, which was very hard. And I quote Faulkner, who said he loved coming to visit Virginia because Virginia was filled with snobs. And he loved snobs because snobs were too busy being snobs that they didn't have time to fool with anybody else. So it was very pleasant. So I wanted to be that. And my entire life in Alexandria, Virginia really led me to this sort of a religion, a civil religion. And I would have said that on a scale of 1 to 2, you may have seen the movie This Is Spinal Tap. This great movie, the mockumentary about a rock band, and they say they have a speaker that goes from to 11. And why? Because 11 is one more than 10.
That's right.
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would have said Lee was an 11. And even though I went to church every Sunday as a good Episcopalian, I would have put Jesus at the 4, 5, 6 range. So it wasn't just that I thought he was good. I had a reverential belief in Lee, and everything about my life, whether it's Confederate Monument in Alexandria, whether it was the schools I went to, parents, everything about it was there to make Lee the best. And Confederates were then seen as honorable. They lost, but they lost honorably.
It's interesting, in my experience going south and getting that idea of what the Virginia gentleman was through the prism of Thomas Jefferson, obviously one of the pantheon of great Virginia men, at least from this perspective. And I was very surprised when I first took the job that people kept referring to him as Mr. Jefferson, that he was held in such reverence that even today, that's how you addressed him. That would change over time in my experience, but that sort of speaks to that mythology, especially in Virginia. It really is deep, and it still exists. And all of this is really tied to the other part of the title of your book is the narrative of the lost cause. And for those of you joining us on the call, we quite often hear about the lost cause, and you have a sense of what that might be. But would you mind explaining that to people and what the lost cause mythology is and how it was created?
Sure. Well, if you think that the southern states, the white Southerners, went to war to protect and expand slavery, which is very clear if you read the secession documents, you hear the cornerstone speech by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who said, that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for slavery today, tomorrow. So the only difference in the Constitution of the Confederacy really is that it mentions slavery and protects it in perpetuity. Well, that's what they went to war with. They wanted to expand it to Cuba, Mexico, Latin America. But in fact, and they lost. They didn't just lose; they were destroyed. 60% of Southern wealth is gone, and that which they wanted most was the continuation of enslavement was gone. And now, with the 13th Amendment ending slavery, 14th Amendment, the guarantee of equal rights, and 15th Amendment, the vote for all Black men, you had the exact opposite of what they wanted. So, how do they deal with this catastrophic defeat? And then how do they deal with coming to and gaining power? So the lost cause myth says that one, the war wasn't about slavery, which is just crazy. It's not true. Two, that slavery wasn't that bad and that it was the best thing to civilize the savages. Well, that's just a monstrosity. Slavery featured the lash, rape, selling families apart for profit, the lash. I mean, it was monstrous. So that's another tenet. A third tenet is that the Confederates were the best soldiers ever. Well, that's hard to imagine if they did lose. Another part was that Reconstruction, this era from 1865 to 1877, which saw Black men serving in high office, 2,000 of them, was an abject failure. And it's a failure because Black people weren't ready for the vote. Well, that's just not true. Again, they served honorably, and the public education starts during this time. The South gets some wealth as they put society back together again. And it's a more biracial society. But what the lost cause says is that that was bad. And what the redeemers, those who come in starting in the 1890s and do these constitutions that create a society that enforces white supremacy. And so this, and then at the top of the lost cause myth, sort of, I guess one below that is Grant was a butcher. And U.S. Grant was not a great general. Of course, he defeated 3 armies, defeated Lee, and it's maybe the greatest soldier ever to wear U.S. Army blue. And I'm wearing a U.S. Army blue tie just in that honor today.
Good for you.
And at the top of it was the Marble Man, the greatest general who ever lived, the greatest man. And of course, he did lose. But the reason the lost cause myth is important is if you think of the pillars of Southern society. The lost cause myth, which changes the meaning of the war, the Confederate monuments outside all these courthouses, new constitutions, which disenfranchise Black people, Jim Crow laws, which are segregation, All of these form the pillars of a white supremacist society enforcing white political power. So the lost cause matters because it's a civic religion to enforce white supremacy and white political power.
And it was a very successful strategy, obviously. The ramifications of that we live with to this very day. And you mention in your book about that mythology and being so ensconced inside of that, and the worshiping really of Robert E. Lee, that it even came down to a decision going to college where you decided to go to Washington and Lee. Can you talk about that thought process, and then a little bit about Robert E. Lee's experience at Washington and then Washington and Lee College, and some of the after effects, what people did to memorialize him once he had passed?
So I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman, and I was living in Georgia at the time. I went to a segregation school in Georgia, and then for college, I wanted to go back to Virginia because I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman. I wanted the status and power that I saw when I was in Alexandria. What better place to go than Washington and Lee University, the two greatest gentlemen in Virginia's history, and therefore the nation. You know, Virginia is the white queen. If you think about a chessboard, the home of presidents, and I wanted to go back there. And so I remember going into Lee Chapel, and I guess the story I prefer to let me tell the story about my last time in Lee Chapel. So if you go in Lee Chapel, it is a chapel, but it has none of the Christian iconography that you would associate with a chapel. I mean, there's no cross, there's no pulpit, there's no, where the hymns are listed, there's none of that. Instead, there is an apse, the sanctuary that Christians would call it. And there's an altar, a white altar. And on top of the altar is Robert E. Lee in Confederate uniform with his blanket covering him, but he's not dead. He's ready to rise up, and uncovering, he's got his hand over his heart and his left hand on his sword, ready to rise up for the white people of the South. And he went there to Washington and Lee after 1865. Crazy that he would accept it, but he accepted a job, excuse me, as the president of the college, and went into this sort of place on the Western frontier in a way, and stayed there for 5 years. He did transform the school. But again, he is still part of this lost cause mythology. He is there saying that Black people should not vote. He's there saying that they should all be kicked out of the state of Virginia. He's saying that just thoroughly racist stuff. But in that sanctuary, in that chapel, I went in there and I took an ROTC scholarship, and I took my commission in there. And I still have a picture of me with hair. Those were glorious days back then, Jeff, I tell you. So I went up on the stage, and I'm right next to a picture of Lee in Confederate gray, almost it's like he's a saint, with this kind of this beautified smile, and the light is on him, and he's sort of resplendent. And so I waited there. Then I took my commission, surrounded by Confederate flags, enemy flags, right there in Lee Chapel. And then I went back and I sat down in the audience, and I raised my right hand and took the oath. I didn't realize then that the oath, not the Confederate, I took the United States oath. And what that oath is an anti-Confederate oath. It was written in 1862. So anyone that served in the federal government, anyone that served in the military, takes an oath written in 1862 to prevent the very thing that Robert E. Lee did. It was written in reaction to him. And so that's where I took that's where really I became a Virginia gentleman. That's what I thought when I was graduating. And I'm entering the same profession that both Washington and Lee did. But that school is very much in the lost cause is in that school's DNA.
Yeah, that's interesting. And as you were sitting there and taking your oath to become a United States soldier, it didn't occur to you at that time? You didn't have the same reaction you're having now?
Frankly, if you excuse my language, I was a dumbass. I mean, really, it was surrounding me if I'd only looked, but my culture didn't put this in. So, I mean, I went all the way through high school. There was only one time that I had a Black teacher in my entire life, at least until I got into the Army. And that was in the 6th grade when I was bused across town from the white elementary school, Douglas MacArthur in Alexandria, Virginia, to the segregated all-Black school. And what was the name of the segregated all-Black school in Alexandria, Virginia? Robert E. Lee Elementary School. Named in 1961 as a reaction to integration. And so, I didn't see it. I didn't understand it, not even a little bit. It took me far too long before I saw the truth.
That's so interesting. to hear. And just sticking with Lexington a little bit, I've been there. Living in Lynchburg, it's an hour away or so from there. So I've been to Lee Chapel. And in your book, you tell a story not only of the worship of Robert E. Lee, but even his horse, Traveler. Can you tell that story, particularly about the pennies? And because I found that so uh, really a telltale sign of the lost cause and the mythology of that war.
Well, it's almost, you think about the lost cause as a religion, you need relics. Every religion has relics. And I was stationed, my family was stationed in Italy for a couple of years, and we used to go to all these churches in southern Italy, which which are linked to the pagan era. So they all have a church named after a martyr. And we'd see these old men and women go in whispering to the bones of their saint to get, for advice, or that somebody's sick. And it was the same way at Lee Chapel. There's his office there, untouched since he died in 1865. He's buried in crypts there. And then right outside is the grave of Traveler, his war steed, the great gray horse. And he's buried there. And people come to this day and leave apples and carrots and pennies. Like pennies. So I was doing the research for this. The pennies, and they always leave it down. Why down? So that the hated face of Lincoln is not visible to Robert E. Lee. And I found this one out recently, so that Lincoln would have to kiss Traveler's ass. I kid you not. This is, yeah. And it's right. I saw another when I was researching this. A woman said that she had got married in Lee Chapel because it was more reverential than any church she had ever been in her life. It is ground zero for the lost cause religion.
It really is, and Lexington itself is that too, because in a graveyard there, Stonewall Jackson is also buried in Lexington. So you have these two pillars of the Southern, especially the Army of Northern Virginia, buried within a mile of each other. And the other element that I recall going to Lexington and going to the cemetery where Stonewall Jackson is a collection of lemons at the base of the statue, because he basically, I believe, would go into battle sucking on lemons, and so people still throw them in there as a tribute. And so it's so ingrained in Southern culture, at least white Southern culture, of course, that it's amazing from someone who coming from the North to the South to sort of dive into that world. And it was very much a shock for me.
Well, and I would tell you just one other story about that. Tony Horowitz, the late great writer of the book Confederates in the Attic, wonderful book, yes. And he calls Lexington the Medina of the lost cause religion. Richmond is the Mecca, and the whole town is based and was for a century based on Confederate tourism. And so, yes, the entire town, and they're just starting to change that now. They're starting to change it. The city changing it in a way more than Washington and Lee is changing it. And VMI is just starting to change it too. They just moved the Jackson statue out, which I think, again, it's good. They're now starting to get after that.
Yeah, that was just this year, I believe, that Jackson statue was removed from that campus. And speaking of military, obviously, after you left Washington and Lee, you had to do your service in the United States Army. And I think you were only planning to do the 4-year obligation, but obviously that changed. And you made yourself into a general retiring last year. Was it last year that you retired?
Yeah, 2020. I did about a year ago.
Oh, yes. Yeah, amazing. And during your career, you posted in different places and different units, obviously, but you also became a historian and taught at West Point, not in one stint, but two. And there's very distinct differences between the two. Could you talk about your first experience at West Point, and then coming back, I think in the early 2000s, and that's where you really had that transformational moment, I believe, in your view of the lost cause narrative with Robert E. Lee and the South in general.
I did. I mean, but the first time I've been there, I was just coming out of grad school, and I've been in the Army maybe 10 years, and I still saw myself as a Virginia gentleman. When I came back, probably in my 18th or 20th year of service, my identity was as Army officer now. My identity, and as historian, both identities, and that is no longer the Southern gentleman. And so I was walking one day to get some swag, some West Point swag for my family, to the cadet store, and I passed by these barracks. And at West Point, our barracks is our highest honor. They're named for some of the greatest soldiers to ever wear U.S. Army blue. So I went by Eisenhower Barracks, Pershing Barracks, Grant Hall, and then I came to the sign for Lee Barracks. And I just stopped and looked at it, and I went, wait a minute. And then I looked east about 20 yards, and there was a new statue put up to Lee in 2001. And I finally said, why are there so many things here named after Lee? And I asked people, they had no idea. And that sent me to the archives because I wanted to know why there are more things named after things at West Point than maybe at Washington Lee. And that archives changed me. And what changed me is that I found out that from 1861 to 1898, really up until 1930, nothing was named after Confederates. In fact, they banished them from memory. No Confederates in the West Point Cemetery. None on our great monument to the Civil War, which says the War of the Rebellion. None in our Memorial Hall. In fact, Duty Honor Country is an anti-Confederate monument. And so then I found out, when did they name these? They named them in the 1930s, the 1950s, 1970s as a reaction to integration. Black cadets came back for the first time in 50 years in the 1930s. Boom, we named Lee Road, which I was living on by Lee Gate and Lee housing area. The picture of Lee in Confederate uniform is a reaction to integration in the Army. And Lee Barracks was named about 1970 at the same time that we were bringing minority admissions and going from a handful of cadets to dozens. So the fact that we named things after Lee to protest integration just made me ferociously angry at both myself for being blind to this and for the military academy and the Army that I loved for doing this and then not changing it.
That seems to be a pattern. And I think you mentioned it's either in your book or in one of the interviews I heard about that reaction, that when there is this advancement in issues of race, there is this negative reaction to it. And you see that all around. And particularly in statues, and you talk quite a bit about statues, not just at West Point, but in other places. And I think of places like Richmond, obviously, where a statue of Robert E. Lee went up at the late 19th century, which is now ready to be removed, but I think it's still within the courts to determine exactly when and how. But that was a direct reaction of the lost cause and that narrative, and to show who was right and who won the war, really, from a Southern perspective, and certainly to as a control mechanism for the African American community as Jim Crow was coming in and sweeping away whatever gains had been brought forward. And you also mentioned Ulysses S. Grant, and obviously there's a Mark Twain connection there, as Mark Twain visited Grant and spoke at GAR programs, Grand Army of the Republic reunions, where Grant was present. But in the 1880s, convinced Grant to allow him to publish his memoirs, which came out in 1885 and, of course, made a tremendous fortune. And I always thought, and I think this is true, that Grant is one of the victims of the lost cause, particularly his role as an officer in the Civil War. Would you go into a little more detail about that and how he has been portrayed and what the reality is?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think Grant's the finest soldier to ever wear U.S. Army blue. And you remember, think about that what he did during the war, he captured 3 armies, was the one that had the best strategic sense of the war, understood what his boss wanted, and then executed it as well as anybody ever has. And as a writer, no one writes more clearly. I mean, reading him is like, ding, it's hearing a bell. It's like hearing what crystal sounds like when you tap it with a fork. I mean, just astonishing. But then for the lost cause to go up, somebody had to take the blame. James Longstreet takes it for Gettysburg because Longstreet, Lee's warhorse, I mean, the great general that on the Confederate side was a Republican and was seen as fighting for biracial equality, which he did. So he's banished for racism. And Grant is made to look terrible. So Jubal Early, who one of the people I love to hate, Jubal Early said that Lee was like a pyramid on the desert floor. In other words, he was the great one, but had no support, whereas Grant was a pygmy on top of Mount Olympus, meaning he had all this support. Another part of the lost cause. Well, no, I mean, the U.S. did not win for that reason. But what changes is that first, in fact, Grant's tomb, what used to have more people see it than did Statue of Liberty in the 1890s. He was seen as a great hero, one of the almost a Christ-like feature along with Washington and Lincoln, sort of the Holy Trinity. But then he's seen as this butcher and this drunk. And then even as late as the 1960s during the centennial, it becomes Grant and Lee, Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, blue and gray, And that's why I don't say the Union Army. I say the United States Army, because they are insurrectionists. They're rebels, insurrectionists. But one story shows you how they saw this. And I've been in Grant's Tomb several times up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's wonderful if you get a chance to go. But in 1965, Civil War Centennial, they put up a mosaic there, a huge mosaic, 30 feet wide, of Grant and Lee shaking hands in Grant's Tomb to show that they were equal. And they're not equal. I mean, much less Lee the best. I mean, Lee had a higher casualty rate. And by the way, he loses. I mean, that's why he loses.
There is that.
There is that, and Grant wins. So yeah, I could extol Grant's virtue for days, and dunk on Lee. But Grant was the finest, again, such a fine soldier, and he won that war. We may not have the United States of America if it wasn't for Ulysses S. Grant.
That's right. I agree with you. And you also mentioned this, that the at least refer in your last comment of having Lee and Grant shaking hands at Grant's Tomb. That's, of course, in a northern city, in New York City. The lost cause isn't just a Southern thing. It has permeated the entire culture. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen and through your research and work?
Yes, I mean, racism. First of all, racism goes from sea to shining sea. I mean, that racism is the virus in the American dirt. It's our eternal pandemic. But the Confederate flag is something I have seen everywhere. I live in upstate New York. I'm at Hamilton College, and I was up in the Adirondacks last weekend with my wife, and we saw 2 Confederate flags. One wasn't just a flag; it was actually a piece of wood carving painted on a barn. When I go visit overseas, I take pictures every time, and every time I've been overseas in Europe, I have seen the Confederate flag next to Old Glory, and maybe Coca-Cola. It's the most visible and identifiable symbol of America, which is just terrible. And it's a flag of white supremacy. It was in 1861. It was in 1898. It is now. So the idea of how, often we say that the winners write the history. Not in this case. The big lie is that Southerners, led by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, changed textbooks, they changed monuments, and then once the Southerners gained political power, then they enforced others to adhere to their will, because the South was a one-party racial police state in much of the 20th century, and that meant that you had to appease them if you want to get any legislation, which is why Social Security didn't include Black people to begin with. The VA loans didn't. FHA, GI Bill, all of these excluded Black people because the Southern senators wouldn't allow it.
So if you ever question what institutional racism is, this is it. This is the very definition of it, and these things still permeate through our culture today. Obviously, I first became aware of you, like a lot of other people, was through your video that you made about the meaning of the Civil War and the causes of it. And obviously, that war started 160 years ago this year. And what was the reaction that you got to that video? Because I'm sure it was mixed. And do you see any light at the end of this tunnel? Do you think that, all of these discussions we've been having and all the issues that happened over the past year, from Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and other protests and Black Lives Matter, do you see a trend going in a positive direction here, or are we still lost in the wilderness as a nation?
Well, yes and no. So I think that video came out about 6 years ago, and I was right after the massacre in Charleston. I did it well before that, but it came out after. And I got death threats to my West Point email address. They trolled me for my looks, which my son sent every one of them to me. He thought they were hilarious, whether an alien or that guy doesn't have a 4 head, he has a 5 head. Which was also
that's what kids are for. Yeah,
that's what kids are for. That's right. But I got the Nation wrote something. The left-leaning news magazine said I was a propagandist for the Army. Stars and Stripes said I was too close to a political organization. The Army investigated me for political speech because I said the Civil War was about slavery. So yes, I got tons, and the things had 34 million views, and I get hundreds of thousands of negative comments on it, mostly 10-to-1 negative. Now, I have told you, I have been getting more positive than negative, far more. So I have seen a huge difference in the last 5 years of this. And certainly in the last 10, the Army is ready to change all these base names. They certainly want to do it. I think the Nation is ready to do this. They see this as treason for slavery. And that's the bumper sticker that I say. Robert E. Lee committed treason to preserve slavery. And if you think about the treason part and then you think about the slavery part, this isn't that hard. So there's still some dead enders who are thinking about this. But I think most Americans are getting to the place, not all, but they're getting to the place where they understand the history, and who we commemorate, that is who we honor, is different than the history. We're still going to teach the Battle of Chancellorsville at West Point, and that Lee whipped Hooker, but who we commemorate talks about our values today, and that's what I certainly want to change. Is who we value. Who we commemorate should represent our values.
That's true. And you know, one thing that I thought was very helpful with your video, a person like me who could talk about this, or other historians, about the myth of the lost cause all day, and people will just say that you're a liberal professor at an elite university. But you were wearing the uniform of a United States soldier, and to me, sharing that with people, it did carry more weight with certain people. So thank you for doing it, even though it took a lot out of you, obviously.
No, I'm proud of it. I'm proud to do it. I mean, it's just history. I'm proud that I did it. I'm proud that it was on a conservative website, which meant it went to more people that were conservative and that saw it differently than I did. But listen, I'm just saying the facts. And the truth is ruthless. The truth may hurt you, but the only way to prevent a racist future is to first understand our racist past. And we've got to agree on the history that 99.999% of all historians agree on. I mean, we can do this as Americans. We Americans aren't made out of cotton candy. We can handle the truth.
That's true. And earlier in the conversation, you talked about going to the archives, and I encourage people to read narratives and read history related to these topics. Obviously, that's where you get the facts, and also looking at the various documents of secession that the Confederate States came up with. Almost to every one mentions slavery as a key element to that. So when you hear that the war was about property rights or northern aggression, that is all part of the lost cause. It was about a property right, and that was unfortunately human bondage, and that's truly it. And just to sort of bring things forward a little bit in the few minutes that we have left, obviously this has been a very challenging year for everyone. And the events of January 6th obviously stick out in everyone's mind. The insurrectionist attack on our Capitol building, something that the insurrectionists of 1861 never attained, reaching Washington and reaching the Capitol building. And other than the general violence and ransacking of the Capitol, of course, people dying, police officers who died that day, the most shocking image for me was seeing that gentleman carrying the Confederate battle flag in the halls of Congress. I can imagine what your reaction to that was, but would you mind talking about that? And do you see any correlation between what happened that day and the legacy of the lost cause myth?
Yeah, I was livid. I mean, I was to see that Confederate flag, the flag of treason, in the people's house. I was ready to put my uniform back on and see if I could get, and see if they needed a really old, bald officer to go in there and kick some insurrectionist ass. Because I mean, I just couldn't believe it. What I also saw as I saw that guy with the flag of treason, over his shoulder is Charles Sumner, and Sumner was the great abolitionist who was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks, but with a cane, because he was excoriating enslavers. And I just could not believe it. And then Sumner's the one that wrote the oath that every one of those senators and congressmen, officers, and everyone, he's the guy that wrote that oath that I took, that everyone that served in the federal government took, and there it was again. So I was incredibly angry that it did that. And I know what we've got to have, and that is, after the Civil War, we did not hold people accountable. And you can't have reconciliation without accountability and justice first. And so what we've got to have, so I do see some parallels. Both sides would not accept the results of a fair and democratic election and would rather overturn it through violence. There's some similarities there. They were also based on racism. Also another similarity. There were white supremacists in that. And so, so I think that's true. But I think that we have to, so what we need to do going forward is make sure that we have accountability and justice, then reconciliation.
I agree, and it makes complete sense to go about in that process. And Do you anticipate there being an independent commission set up to review this? Would you make that recommendation if you had that capability, power?
I totally would make that recommendation. I know many people have. I think this is what you do commissions for, is to get to the bottom of things, find out why they happen, change laws, regulations, or whatever you need to ensure it doesn't happen again. But we had a monstrous an aberration, a violent insurrection, sedition happen on January 6th, and it cannot happen again. And so we've got to make sure we know what that is, and then hold those people accountable that did it.
Absolutely, and that's the key part, and that's the key part in any, not just in our country, but around the globe. When you don't hold people accountable, it gives them the power to do it again or to try something like that again. So it's absolutely critical that people go to jail, and that even leadership level people are held accountable for what they've done. So that's so interesting. And speaking of leadership, you briefly mentioned this idea of base naming and changing, and of course now I believe it's federal law, or a law was passed that all the bases in the United States that are named after Confederate officers or Confederates must be changed. And I believe you're on that commission now. Is that correct?
I am, yes.
Yeah, you're appointed by the new Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Can you talk about that work, if it's begun, what the path will be, and what are some of those bases that you're talking of? And you mentioned Fort Belvoir in your book. I live about 2 miles from there now, so I have a better understanding. So if you could share that story as well, and how that name came to be.
Well, but the names, Fort Belvoir, which is right out just south of Alexandria, right where I grew up too, it was initially named after A.A. Humphreys, a distinguished Civil War general on the U.S. side, was at Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, was at Appomattox, and helped capture Lee. And it was changed in 1935. It was a home of engineers, and he was one of the greatest engineers of the 19th century, commanded the engineers. And then it was changed in 1935 because a segregationist congressman, Howard W. Smith of Alexandria, demanded that he did not want it because he was a segregationist, his family were Confederates, and he hated that in his backyard. So he at first voted against the Social Security Act. So 2 days after he voted against it, FDR came and changed it to Belvoir, and and then a couple months later, Smith voted for the legislation. And then Belvoir, what is Belvoir? It's the name of a slave plantation, or as I call it, an enslaved labor farm. I'm not calling this Moonlight and Magnolias name plantation, which you think Terra and the wind whispering through the Spanish moss. No, these are sites of mass atrocities. So he named it after Belvoir, which is a slave plantation owned by Lord Fairfax that burned to the ground in 1783. And Fairfax was a loyalist for the United Kingdom, not for the U.S. And by the way, Lord Fairfax actually paid to rape enslaved women at the age of 83. So it's just monstrous. And I'll just tell you one other one. Then I know we have to get to questions. But Fort Gordon is named for John Brown Gordon, who fought for the Confederate side, and after the war never served in U.S. Army Blue. And after the war, he gave a speech to Black Charlestonians where he said, "If you demand equality, I promise you we will start a race war, and the 40 million of us, white people, will exterminate," that's the word he used, exterminate the 4 million of you Black people. And he founded the KKK and led it for years. So who we named these after, we named them in World War I and World War II, represent a white supremacist army and a white supremacist society that named these.
So when do you think these names will change? Will it be next year, next couple of years? What's the timetable?
That's sort of, I am on the commission. I don't really know that. Don't know that yet. And if I knew it, I wouldn't tell you because I certainly have to, leave that to, that's the internal work of the commission. But I am so proud and honored to be able to, in fact, to serve on this commission, I had to raise my right hand and take that oath again. I'm so honored, so honored to serve the nation again.
And as you said, we do have to wrap up our conversation so we can get to questions. But I just wanted to close with, for you to share that if there was one lesson or one idea, concept that you want people to walk away with after reading your book, what would that be?
I think it would be that we all have a history, and each one of our hometowns has a history. And if we don't know our own history about ourselves and the places that we lived, then we won't be able to know. If we don't know where we were, we won't know where to go. We don't know where we've been, we don't know where to go. And so for me, I found so much of understanding myself and my nation and my country and my army, my profession, by looking at the history. So we can all be historians of ourselves and our hometown. And if you do that, if you look at it carefully, particularly about race, I think you'll find that there's things that we need to change about our society, and it'll change you in the process. It certainly changed me. What we research and write can change our character, and that's what it did for me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ty, for sharing this with us and sharing your story and being so open about it in your book. I think it will help a lot of people to overcome their issues or sometimes their childhood upbringing as well, and think about the world in a different way. So with that, Jennifer, turn it back to you so we can get to the Q&A section of tonight's program.
Give me a moment, please. I have to say, our audience has been digging this. We have Sharon saying that this is the best thing I've watched for sure in the past year, maybe ever.
Wow. Thank you, Sharon.
Nice.
I'm going to have a drink of water to that.
I'll toast you. Really, this is why we do what we do. And I thank you both for a fascinating, stimulating, and just really thoughtful conversation about topics that are really not easy to discuss in a civil way. So we really appreciate that you brought that civility and thoughtfulness to it. We have some really great questions, so I'm going to jump right in. And these are, I'm going in order. This one has 3 votes. It was originally posted by Tom, who says, did you experience any this is for Ty, did you experience any personal issues with your speaking out about Lee and Lost Cause? Did your colleagues, whether officers, instructors, or cadets, confront you or give the impression they thought you were overstepping the bounds of propriety in the Army?
Yes, several times. I was, when I first brought this up, how this came about was that I was in charge of the memorialization committee at West Point, and I argued that we should not put we had no place for all the 1,500 names of those who fought for the nation, who gave the last full measure of devotion to the nation, who died from the War of 1812 through the wars of 9/11. And we had lost 100 graduates killed at West Point in the wars since 9/11. And the community was reeling, needed a place to recognize our heroes. So I came up with this idea of having a memorial room. And I got the money, the design, I got everything. But then there was like, well, should Confederate graduates who died fighting for the Confederates, should they go in the memorial room? And you can imagine what how my vote was, which is they fought against their country, renounced their oath, killed U.S. Army soldiers for the worst possible reason, to create a slave republic. And I brought that into our leadership, and they said no. And he wasn't the only the superintendent, the 3-star general, said, no, we want to bring people together. We don't want to be like the Sunni and the Shia, which on the scale of historical analogies is like below 0. It's like the worst historical analogy you could ever have in your right. It's terrible. And so I lost. And I lost this. So in fact, I went back to my wife, said, oh my gosh, I lost this, tail between my legs. They didn't listen to my arguments, and my arguments were devastatingly brilliant. I will tell you that right now. But what happened is that history wasn't strong. Facts weren't going to change them. You needed a story. And that's what my wife told me. My wife told me, you got to have a story, Ty. Tell your story. You're hiding your own story. And that's why really I'm using myself, is because my wife is more brilliant than I am. And she understood that only through the storytelling could we actually change people's minds. So yeah, I had lots, and one of the reasons that I chose to retire, I had other reasons, but one of the reasons was I could not have written this book under the previous administration. They were going to give West Point a hard time. They were going to give the Army a hard time. And I love the Army and West Point, and I couldn't do that. So I couldn't publish what I wanted to about treason for slavery because it was too hot a topic for the Army. But now, as a civilian, the First Amendment is my jam. I am loving talking and with the First Amendment, where I can say whatever the hell I want to. And so good question. Thank you.
Oh, it was a good question. Thank you for a good answer, too. E. Byrne, who's been very active here this evening, wants to know, how early was the label "The Lost Cause" used?
It was used at the first book. Edward Pollard wrote a book in 1865, 1866. They used it. And it was the Lost Cause starts before the smoke has cleared from the battlefield. In General Orders Number 9, Robert E. Lee says he only lost because of overwhelming force. And he's really saying we lost this war honorably. And it was only the immigrant armies and these nefarious, sulfurous generals like Grant and Sherman, these butchers, the only reason we lost, but we kept our honor. So really, Lee starts it in 1865 with General Orders Number 9, and the lost cause is used almost immediately after that. So it starts very quickly. Some people say, oh, it doesn't start till the 1890s. Not true. It starts immediately, and people like Jubal Early write that. I mean, he writes almost a complete lost cause memoir in the 1868, I think. So it happens very quickly.
Oh, thank you. That was good to learn. Can you speak a bit about the very serious preparations for a federal treason trial of Lee that never happened? Asks our friend Craig Hotchkiss, who's one of our historic interpreters at the Mark Twain House.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a great book on this called The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee by John Reeves. So if you really want to get into it, I really recommend that book. It's just outstanding. But an overview for some of this, not particularly my area of expertise, is that Lee and several dozen Confederates, including I think his son and nephew Jefferson Davis, are indicted for treason. And there is but the question is, where do you try him? Do you try him in front of a mixed race jury? Do you try him only in front of white Southerners? Do you take him to DC and try him there? So between prosecutorial incompetence, unwillingness to let the judge there try it with a biracial jury, it just sort of fizzles out. And by the time 1868 rolls around, Andrew Johnson, who really wanted to hang some traitors, I mean, he really wanted to do that. Everyone sort of loses steam on this. And in 1868, he is given amnesty. And amnesty is what a group does. You get a group amnesty. A pardon is what you do individually. So by saying amnesty and by signing a loyalty oath, which Lee does, I mean, what people say is that really admitted to guilt. Now, he may not have said that, but that's certainly what the secretary. I mean, that's what some of the people in Lincoln administration were saying, or the Johnson administration is signing this loyalty oath is an admittance of guilt. So there are a bunch of reasons why he wasn't tried. But I do think, I'm not sure that hanging him would have been the answer, but accountability certainly was something that they did not do well among the Confederates after the war.
Thank you for that. So Pat wants to know, what about the fact that at Appomattox, Grant let the insurrectionists return to their homes with little consequence for their treason?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I mean, what they were trying to do was to try. I mean, this is the thing about a civil war, is how do you bring the country back together? It's not like Germany, which is overseas. You got to knit the country back together. And Grant is trying to end this war and trying to think about what the peace will be like. And I can't second guess him there. The problem is that the white South was unwilling to accept the results of this war, which they brought on themselves, which is black equality, black male equality. And because they couldn't accept that, they start fighting against that. And Lee is one of the ones who is refusing to accept racial equality, refuses to accept the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So I'm not saying that necessarily that Grant did the wrong thing. And certainly he could have held political leaders accountable. And if this was a military thing, if Lincoln had eventually wanted to hold them, they could say, listen, Grant, you can say what you want. You have your sphere, I have mine. I can still do what I want. Of course, he's killed immediately thereafter, and we'll never know what Lincoln wanted to do. But what happened is that the South, white Southerners, were unwilling to accept what this war created, which was freedom and eventually equality for black people. And that was what they fought more than anything for. And that's really what the lost cause is there to do, is to enforce white supremacy. That's what Confederate monuments do. That's what the constitutions do in the 1890. It's what the United Daughters of the Confederacy does. It's what the Confederate flag means, is white supremacy.
Oh, okay. Wow, thank you. Sarah would like to know, do you find that your college students at West Point and Hamilton seem to have more accurate knowledge of American and Civil War history than your generation?
Oh, Lord, yes. I mean, my first chapter book was Meet Robert E. Lee. And here, wait a minute, prop time. Here it is.
There it is.
That was my first chapter book. Look, you can see him. I mean, how regal he looks. He's carrying his sword like it's a ceremonial mace. He doesn't even need to have to hold traveler's reins because the horse is so smart. And there's only, this is the actual book, by the way, and there's only two instances of black people in this. Wait a minute. Here it is. One is a enslaved servant driving Robert E. Lee from the home, his ancestral home at Stratford to Alexandria, my hometown, and the other one is during John Brown's raid into modern day West Virginia, and they're these crazed insurrectionists trying to kill the great Robert E. Lee. So they're either enslaved people, docile enslaved people, or these crazy people trying to kill all white people. So and the textbooks I had written by the state of Virginia that I had as a kid were where to support massive resistance. And that's what, so the cover of one of the chapters in the book, it was written first in the 50s, reissued in 1964, that I had in the early 70s, or early to mid 70s, actually had a picture of a family on a boat. And there was an African family, two boys, two girls in colonial finery, shaking hands with a colonial white man. And the woman is sort of saying, oh my gosh, somebody's finally going to take care of us. They were coming off the Middle Passage. They were enslaved people that were about to go into servitude for the rest of their life and their grandchildren's life and their great-grandchildren's life. And yet my textbook made it seem like they were entering into what they called a social security arrangement. It was monstrous. So yeah, how could anything be worse than that? So yeah, they're getting a much better idea of it. And my students certainly are. And my kids didn't grow up with this because I drilled it into them. But I do think most of it is getting more accurate. And the fact that you can find these secession documents on the web, and you can find short videos by Khan Academy, or I've done one, or historian Karen Cox has done one, allows more people to get proper information. So I'm more positive about this next generation, certainly, than about mine.
Wow. Thank you for that. And I was going to ask you, we have a few more viewer questions, our audience questions, but I was just going to ask you, are you optimistic at this stage in our nation's history and with all we've been through? How do you feel? Optimistic, pessimistic, realistic?
Yeah, I go back to the racism is the virus in the American dirt, our eternal pandemic, and it infects everything and everyone. And we have to go after that harder than we are. But we're Americans. Churchill once said that you can count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. So I think we're doing better than we've ever done before. Interestingly, as always, it takes Black people protesting to make white people see the problem. And I'm hoping that this time around, the protests that came over the summer, the Black Lives Matter protest, the protest against the murder of George Floyd, more white people are seeing the issue because we don't see it, because we don't have to see it. But if you look at your town and the history of your town, because you will find redlining in your town, I promise you, you will find segregated housing covenants that prevent Black people from owning property. So the reason that we are a segregated society today is because of governmental policy yesterday and today. So I am hopeful, but I am only hopeful as far as we agree to look at our past and be open about it and about the racism that permeates our society in systemic ways, and then start working for it. Because I know history isn't going to change systemic racism, but you can't change systemic racism without understanding the historical context with which it came about. So I am hopeful, but I'm keeping an eye on it too. What did Reagan say about the Soviet? Trust but verify.
Right.
Well, thank you. So Muriel, I hope I said your name correctly, wants to know, you mentioned Confederates in the attic in your talk. She's wondering if you found any parallels or contrasts in your book and Horowitz's.
Oh, yes. What a brilliant book. First of all, he's just such a great writer, such a great eye for reporting. So, yeah, I certainly found that he's talked about the lost cause. I didn't go into what he did so much, which were the reenactors. But I have spent a lot of time on Civil War battlefields. We took cadets. Cadets have been going to Civil War battlefields at least since George Patton was a cadet. And we still have them walk the Day 3 attack at Gettysburg. But what's changing about it is, and I think Horowitz's book does this, is we talk about the purpose now. So those reenactors back that Horowitz talked about in the late 90s never talked about the purpose of the war. And I hope no one goes to a Civil War battlefield without talking about the purpose of that war and why they were fighting. And we don't get seduced by the smell of gunpowder, by the X's and O's, that as though it's like an Ohio State Michigan game, an LSU, an Auburn Alabama game, where you just see the forces going at one another, and you can get lost in the tactical fight. But you've got to always remember, which so many of Horowitz's characters don't, but which Horowitz always does, which is this war was fought to perpetuate human enslavement and the bondage and the rape of women, the breaking apart of families for profit, just the horrible monstrosity that was the system of human bondage in the South.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry. We're running out of time. We have so many great questions from the audience, and I'm so grateful that you have posted these questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them, and I am sorry for that. But try to get a few more in. Is that
Sure.
okay with you, Ty and Jeff?
Absolutely.
And Jeff, you could chime in too if you have anything. You're being so polite and listening. But if you have
I'm sorry about that, Jeff. Yeah.
No, keep going.
I'm on a roll.
I'm learning. I'm here to listen. So you're the guest speaker. So please keep going.
Kristen wants to know, we're curious about what generals you would like to see commemorated by naming military bases for them.
Well, I'm not going to say anything that I'm doing on the base naming commission, but I will say I wrote an article in June in the Washington Post that did look at people possibilities, and the reason I did it was just to show how easy it would be, that we have so many heroes. I was doing in the U.S. Army because most of these things are named after the U.S. Army, but the U.S. Army has so many heroes that represent the value, diversity, and courage of the United States of America. And I'll just name one. And listen, I'm not saying that this is anyone that we would do. This is what I wrote about in this June article. But one was Vernon Baker, who was a Black lieutenant in Italy who charged 5 different machine gun nests, saving his platoon from sure disaster against the Germans. Another one was Ted Rubin, who was a Holocaust survivor came from Hungary, was a Jew, survived a Holocaust death camp, emigrated to the United States, joined the army, fought in Korea, and on a hilltop, his platoon was almost overrun by a North Korean, I think it was a North Korean force, maybe it was Chinese force, and he was able to hold that off long enough for most of his platoon to get away. He was finally captured. When he was captured, he was sent to a North Korean prisoner of war camp, and we had terrible problems among soldiers and Marines in North Korean camps, where they were able to separate them, and several of them actually sort of helped the enemy. But Rubin stole food from the North Koreans, which would have resulted in death if he'd been caught, fed his fellow platoon. And then he was offered, because he was originally from Hungary, a communist country, that they would repatriate him back to Hungary. All he had to say was yes, and he refused to go. He was denied the Medal of Honor because of anti-Semitism, and eventually got it in like 2009. So those are just 2 stories of amazing soldiers who represent the values, diversity, and courage of the United States of America. And those are the type of people. And again, I'm not saying those are them. Those are just ones that I've written about previously. But boy, what heroism that those who have served in the U.S. Army.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to close on. And again, I'm sorry, people, awesome questions, but I think we're running out of time. Perhaps some of your questions will be answered in Tony's book.
Well done, Jeff. Thank you so much.
And again, please remember that we know you have other options for purchasing this book, but buying it through us is a big help to us. So please do.
It'll be signed, and just so you know, I sent some book plates so that they'll be able to be signed by me if you buy it through the museum.
Thank you for reminding us of that, Ty. I was just about to say the same thing. So I just want to say that the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And I hope that you feel part of that circle of writers now, Ty, and I hope that you'll be part of our community moving forward. And we talked about having you come and visit us in person as soon as it's possible to do so. So please, let's count on doing that. This has been an amazing audience. When we do our programs in person in our auditorium, which holds a fraction of the number of people who have registered for tonight, we to take you on a tour of the house, and I lost my whole train of thought. No, our speakers always comment on how great the audience questions are, and this has borne itself out tonight. So thank you, audience. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being here with us. You did an amazing job of preparing and asking questions on behalf of the audience. And Ty, thank you very much for writing your book and for sharing your insights with us tonight. So I'm going to say good night. Everybody join me in thanking our speakers for a really fascinating evening, and hope to see you again soon. And yes, this was recorded, everybody. I see a lot of questions about that. This is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it on our website at marktwainhouse.org. So it'll be there by tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ty.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Good night, everybody.